Good afternoon. Glad to join you. It's been a few months on this amazing Sunday, June 1st, 2025. I just found out this past week that an amazing mentor, amazing writer, Ngũgĩ passed, and I couldn't let a week go by without sharing exactly the works that he wrote that impacted me and how they impacted me. I want to share from three of his works. The first is a theoretical text called Decolonizing the Mind that I remember reading in grad school to earn my PhD. And then I took a class in grad school called African Literature by Dr. Abu Abari, who was from Ghana. And he taught us, uh, the course was called African Literature. In that course, I wrote a paper comparing two main characters in different novels by Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. Uh, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to read an excerpt of that paper that I wrote about Ngugi's two novels. And then I want to finish with his memoir, Dreams in a Time of War, because that really brings it back to the foundation of the Garvey movement, which influenced his dad, Ngugi's dad, who influenced him undoubtedly in terms of what it is like to be colonized, go to a colonial school, but still use it to his strategic advantage, not taking in everything. What Ngugi clearly did in his life is eat the meat and spit out the bones. He learned to go through school, but not believing that he was inferior, the way that the English colonial school was teaching him in Kenya. He used it to empower himself, his fellow Gikuyu, and the world. His whole story is fascinating to me. Just his experience, the way he narrated his experience going to an English colonial school in Kenya gave me a different perspective on colonization as an African American son of Jamaican immigrants. And Ngugi really schooled me on what it means, what colonization really means, how those schools teach African men, women, children, people to think of themselves as inferior. So I wanted to begin by just looking at the first excerpt of the theoretical text Ngugi wrote, which is called Decolonizing the Mind. And in this piece, he's talking about uh, being colonized, going to the schools. That's what really fascinates me about Ngugi's work. The aspects that fascinated me the most was how he was clear. And for me as a Christian, today is a Sunday, which is our day of attending church for Christians in the West. But I just want to say this before I read the excerpt. For me, Ngugi showed how Christianity, the most powerful thing that Ngugi's fiction taught me was that Christianity does not belong to Europeans. And you really get that theme. For me, that's the theme that spoke the loudest in A Grain of Wheat that I read and in Wizard of the Crow that I'm going to read an excerpt on. I wrote a paper about those two novels, but I wanted to look theoretically at his work, Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature. Thus, he writes, one of the most humiliating experiences was to be caught speaking Gikuyu, his native tongue, in Kenya, in the vicinity of the school. The culprit was given corporal punishment, 3 to 5 strokes of the cane on bare buttocks, or was made to carry a metal plate around the neck with inscriptions such as, I am stupid, or I am a donkey. Sometimes the culprits were fined money they could hardly afford. And how did the teachers catch the culprits? A button was initially given to one pupil who was supposed to hand it over to whoever was caught speaking his mother tongue. Whoever had the button at the end of the day would sing who had given it to him, and the ensuing process would bring out all the culprits of the day. Thus, Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes, children were turned into witch hunters, and in the process were being taught the lucrative value of being a traitor to one's immediate community. And I thought that was powerful. And this is why Ngugi's work speaks so soundly. It was awesome to see so many people recognize him for his work. And I said, I have to really dig in and go back into my own um, Google files, old files, and I came up on a paper I wrote about a novel that was coming out. It came out in 2006 when I was in grad school. It's called The Wizard of the Crow. It is set in the fictional African nation of Aburiria, but through that fictional nation, you could tell as a reader of Ngũgĩ, he is seriously criticizing neocolonialism and how westernized African leaders brutalize their own people for the sake of the material dollar. That for me was what spoke so soundly about his novel, The Wizard of the Crow. In the paper that I wrote, I compared that to, I believe, his third novel, A Grain of Wheat, and the main character in each. This is the paper I wrote. It's called Taking an Oath of Unity, a literary analysis of Kahika in A Grain of Wheat and Kamiti in Wizard of the Crow. And then I quoted from Gikonyo in A Grain of Wheat. Would Uhuru bring the land into African hands? And would that make a difference to the small man in the village? Uh, Wationgo's character Gikonyo asks. In The Wizard of the Crow, this is a novel that Wationgo wrote later in his career. When I was in grad school, this novel came out. So right when it came out is when I read it and wrote this paper. We oppose the right of might with the might of right, where it says, use your God-given powers of divination. And she's talking to the Wizard of the Crow for the benefit of the people, the movement. Yawira in Wizard of the Crow says to the main character, who is the Wizard of the Crow, who has special powers, but the powers that be in Aburiria, in Wationgo's fictional Aburiria, of course, want to use the Wizard of the Crow for their own personal material gain purposes, not for ethical purposes for the benefit of the people. I write, perhaps no African writer has addressed the question of language more diligently than Kenyan writer Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, formerly James Ngũgĩ. His novels raise important questions about the limitations of the English language in not only expressing the essence of African peoples, but also in understanding the essence of African peoples. Two of his novels address the issues raised in the above epigraphs. The various issues of decolonization are addressed in his third novel, A Grain of Wheat. I said his second, it's actually his third novel, published in 1968. And the various issues of the post-colonial African nation are addressed in his latest novel. He wrote, I believe, several other works after '06's Wizard of the Crow. Wationgo raises the question of not only language, but also the interpretation of language. He writes that language is the collective memory bank of a people. By insisting on writing in his native Gikuyu, Wationgo rejects a certain kind of collective memory in the English language that tends to denigrate concepts or ideas that are uniquely African. Because the language of English was used to colonize Africans, concepts in English words that are exclusively African tend to develop pejorative connotations. And I just wanted to go to the excerpt where I first begin talking about that third novel, A Grain of Wheat. In A Grain of Wheat by Wationgo, we are introduced to Kahika in the party meeting at Rungai Market. He is described as a small man with a strong voice. We see him as a highly respected leader of the people in the Tabai village due to his fighting the British alongside Jomo Kenyatta. The narrator tells us that the greatest triumph for Kahika was the famous capture of Mahi. In this area, British had imprisoned Kenyans, and Kahika's rescue of these prisoners is described in valiant terms. Kahika's men broke into the prison and led the prisoners out into the night. The garrison was set on fire, and Kahika's men, guns, and ammunition continued the war on a scale undreamt of in the days of Waiyaki and young Harry. People came to know Kahika as the terror of the white man, end quote. We do not get any glimpse, I write, into the kind of thinking that produced a revolutionary like Kahika until the 7th chapter of Wationgo's novel, where we read about his being expelled from a missionary school for arguing with his teacher about a biblical interpretation. It is In this incident, that Watiango presents us a unique interpretation of Christianity, which, like the English language, can be used to liberate oneself and others from exploitive European domination. One day at Mahiga, a European missionary school, Kahika's teacher, Teacher Muniu, tells the class that circumcision of women is a heathen custom. In strong objection, Kahika blurts, "That is not true, sir. It is just the white people say so. The Bible does not talk about circumcising women." So the argument here is not so much about whether it is ethical, because there's a lot of debate, and it's very ethical, very unethical and painful for women to endure circumcision, but he's talking about how the missionaries are improperly taking that practice and ascribing it to all the Kikuyu as heathen. And because it's a subconscious way of teaching Kikuyu that they are heathen, that Watiango's main character, Kihika, challenges. Teacher Munio responds by turning to the 7th chapter and the 18th verse of 1 Corinthians of the Bible, which discusses circumcision. Kihika insists that the Bible does not discuss this topic, and in response, Teacher Muniyu plans to flog Kihika in front of the class to teach him a lesson. Instead, Kihika reached the nearest window and climbed out of the church, Watiango writes, to freedom. I want to skip down to the part where I mentioned his latest novel, Wizard of the Crow. Watiango shows layers or levels of disdain of witchcraft within the ruler's cabinet. This is now talking about Wizard of the Crow. Even though the Wizard of the Crow managed to restore the power of speech to the ruler did not want to recognize him. Machokali, who is subservient in Watiango's novel to the ruler, participates in the denigration of the Wizard of the Crow by dodging any recollection of having an idea about inviting the wizard in the first place, for fear of being associated with sorcery. I just want to pause here on my paper because Watiango makes so clear how sorcery is looked down upon and how African leaders work very hard to make sure that the Western eye cannot accuse them of having any involvement in sorcery. He makes that super clear in The Wizard of the Crow. And here the Wizard of the Crow says, it was not really my idea, anything to do with sorcery or divination. I tried to keep while they are in America, Machakali and the ruler want to give the best impression to white and powerful Westerners that they, the ruler of Aburiria, do not believe or condone what Western notions and European worldviews have dismissed as witchcraft. Therefore, they maintain an African denigration narrative. And that was something in this paper that I talked about, how and Watiango was making clear an African denigration narrative that was kind of like the invisible elephant in the room that framed a lot of the speeches of Watiango's characters who were political leaders. So he's really driving home. A lot of their behavior is based on receiving Western funding. A lot of these African leaders' behavior is only explained by Western funding. And he has this group Watiango does called the Global Bank, that if you study the history of, the IMF, it's clearly the World Bank. It's Watiango's version of the World Bank. Ultimately, I write here, the Global Bank denies Aburiria any money for reasons related to the values of the Western nation state, gender construction, and the alleged democracy that allows Western private companies its exploitation. The Global Bank issues the following message to the ruler of Aburiria: Mr. President, everything is upside down in your country. Your women are challenging the natural order of things, even setting up what they call people's courts, and the accused challenge the social order. We don't need to remind you of the obvious. If the masses take the law into their own hands, you will have nothing but chaos on yours. Mr. President, go back to Aburiria for your put your house in order, is that last sentence. And what I write is that because of the intense oppression due to the effects of an African denigration narrative that Watiango is presenting us with, He shows us a wizard who seeks refuge in alcoholism and who is arguably a testament to the detrimental effects of this African denigration narrative. However, he ends at the end. This was a typo. It looked like I made in my paper. He is restored. More like Kahika, he goes on a quest for Black power. And like Kahika, the wizard and the crow see their roles as endemic to spiritual understanding. For Kahika, it was the Bible, whereas for Kamiti in The Wizard and the Crow, it was the knowledge he gleaned while living in India. Kamiti is the Wizard of the Crow, and he becomes enlightened the same way that Kahika and a grain of wheat was enlightened. So for Watiango, growth is really becoming what growth means is becoming radicalized, which is a theme I discussed in my very first book, the third novel, my fourth chapter on Pauline Hopkins's third novel, where that white character, Warren Maxwell, goes through his growth when he becomes radicalized. Watiango ends Wizard of the Crow on a hopeful note, with the character AG continuing the storytelling that allowed him to be more sympathetic to the cause for the movement of the voice of the people. That's the movement that Wanira introduces Kamiti, who is the Wizard of the Crow, to. Of all the characters, AG, probably experienced the most thorough transformation, and he represents the hope of the movement, which would continue the kind of work that Kahiti and the anti colonial struggle devoted their lives to. And I just want to make clear the last point here that the blue part is covering. Watiango writes, let me see. Oh, okay, I got it. Um, Watiango suggests that the party fighting Britain in Kenya in a grain of wheat remains alive in his later novel, Wizard of the Crow, in the movement for the people. That's the theme of Watiango's work, the responsibility of the individual to the community around him. It's not just about what we've seen in many Lionsgate films, the individual person getting the job, getting the partner. In Watiango's work, the freedom and the development comes when the main character feels a sense of accomplishment for fulfilling his duty to the community and not just getting the partner or not just getting the house or not just getting the material thing or not just getting the job. So that was a powerful theme in Watiango's work. I want to finish my last three paragraphs here. Uh, so in summary, oh, yes, absolutely. Of all the characters, yes, Watiango suggests that the party fighting Britain in Kenya in a grain of wheat remains alive in the movement for the people and the Wizard of the Crow. It remains alive not only from their religious beliefs driven by their might of right, articulated by Wanira, but it remains alive due to a political will to organize against injustice. They would pray that God protect their hideouts. Pardon me, I'm reading different words that are not there. So they would pray that God would protect their hideouts, very similar to how abolitionists who believe in God would pray also that God would protect the hideouts for the runaways who were on that Underground Railroad. I was told to make sure I watch that series that's being done now on Prime Video. I have to make time for that. Um, but I had to shout out Ngũgĩ because he meant so much to me as a writer and how to draw an arc, how to tell a story, how to maintain your sanity and fulfill your responsibility to the community at the same time. And that was strong in his work. So I got to shout him out. Um, in The Wizard of the Crow, I wrote that the characters there would pray that God protect their hideouts while Nyawira and Kamiti, I've been saying Yanira, but it's Nyawira. That is the female character who influences the main character in Wizard of the Crow so strongly. They operate from a similar religious belief. Comiti said, I must follow in the footsteps of John the Baptist and make my bed in the wilderness. And like the homeless, I would seek my sustenance in the garbage dump. Here, Comiti is essentially acting like Christ and fulfilling what Kihika told Karanja. He understands that he is Christ. Kihika and Comiti have both taken the same oath of unity that vows to end oppressive practices. In summary, Comiti is the fulfillment of Kahiti's work and represents the struggle against European domination. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's English translation of this most recent novel presents a narrative that clearly removes the stigma of inferiority from uniquely African practices. And the last piece by Ngũgĩ himself that I wanted to recognize was his childhood memoir, which is called Dreams in a Time of War. He mentions people that were influential to him and that also I mention in my book. Make sure you check out my book. You buy my book, it's on Amazon. It is called To a More Positive Purpose. I wanted to read this excerpt of Ngũgĩ's memoir talking about the leader Harry Thuku. He mentions the East African Association, founded in 1921, the first countrywide African political organization led by Harry Thuku, who captured the imagination of all working Africans, including my father. In him, an African working class, the new social force on the stage of Kenyan history, and of which my father was now part, had found his voice. Harry Thuku forged connections with Marcus Garvey's international Black nationalism to the West in America, and with Gandhi's Indian nationalism to the East. The latter through his alliance with Manila Desai, a leader of local Indians. His activities were closely monitored by the colonial secret police and discussed in the London Colonial Office as a menace to white power. Both Gandhi and Thuku, wa Thiong'o writes, had called for civil disobedience at about the same time in their respective countries. To suppress this Kenyan link between Gandhian nationalism and Garveyism, Black nationalism, the British arrested Thuku in March 1922 and deported him to Kismayu, now in Somalia, where he languished for 7 years. But that doesn't underestimate his importance. Who also talks about Harry Thuku is the now late Harry Belafonte in his book called My Song. And you see the connection between Thuku Belafonte and Thuku, as well as wa Thiong'o's father, who would raise an incredible writer who would educate African people and the world about the reality of growing up, what it means to speak in your native tongue and the importance of writing in it, and teaching the world about the value of Kikuyu culture and his experience, wa Thiong'o's experience in the colonial school. In my book, I talk specifically about Harry Thuku, because my latest book, which you can buy on Amazon, it is right here. Go to Amazon.com. I will absolutely put the link in the chat at the conclusion of this. But if you enter this title or my name, it will pop up, and that is where you can buy the book. On page 45 of this book, when I'm talking specifically about Tony Martin's work, Marcus Garvey Hero, he mentions African leaders who were influenced by Garvey. One of them was Nnamdi Azikiwe, who in 1960 became the first governor general of independent Nigeria. And Nkrumah writes in his autobiography, Kwame Nkrumah, that Garvey's book, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, had a greater influence on his thinking than any other work he ever read. And I have to shout that out. Later in that same part of Marcus Garvey Hero, Tony Martin writes that Harry Thuku, who was a major Kenyan nationalist in the 1920s, and who Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o says influenced his father, corresponded with Garvey. Harry Thuku corresponded with Garvey, as well as Jomo Kenyatta, a disciple of Thuku and the later first president of Kenya, considered himself a Garveyite at this time. So you see the influence of Marcus Garvey, and there's no text that covers that more thoroughly than my own book. to a more positive purpose. Critical responses to the scholarship of Tony Martin. You can buy this book on Amazon. Please subscribe, like, and share my YouTube. If you've learned a lot about Ngũgĩ, go and read his novel, Wizard of the Crow. Go and read his novel, A Grain of Wheat. Read his nonfiction work, listen to his speeches, understand the power, the importance of learning your own language. If you learned anything from my talk today on Ngũgĩ, don't hesitate to support my Cash App. It's $Roan Fraser. And please go check out my book. Read Ngũgĩ, read Wizard of the Crow, read A Grain of Wheat, understand the message that he's saying, and check out that awesome theoretical text, Decolonizing the Mind. I thank you so much for joining me on IG, on StreamYard, on YouTube to talk about the legacy of Ngũgĩ. Read his work and know the power of your voice. I thank you for joining me. Again, read the work of Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o and know the power of his voice.